Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, morning, whenever it is you may be watching this recording of this webinar. My name is Lisa Presley, and I'm one of the Congregational Life Consultants for the MidAmerica Region. I am thrilled to be present for what is the last of our series of webinars. I'm not thrilled that it's the last, but I'm thrilled to be able to be here with the series of webinars that the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance has been producing with us and been providing content so that we can make sure that our congregations are well equipped to do social justice work moving forward. So tonight with me is Ashley Horan, who is the executive director of Moose Jaw, and also Pastor Danny Gibbons, who is the statewide organizer for Moose Jaw. As we begin tonight, I just want to use a chalice lighting. So just imagine yourself lighting a chalice in your heart or on your table. These words are by the poet Denise Levertov, and it's entitled The Fountain. Don't say there is no water to solace the dryness at our hearts. I have seen the fountain springing out of the rock wall and you drinking there. And I too, before your eyes, found footholds and climbed to drink the cool water. The woman of that place, shading her eyes, frowned as she watched, but not because she grudged the water, only because she was waiting to see we drank our fill and were refreshed. Don't say there is no water. The fountain is there among its scalloped gray and green stones. It is still there and always there, with its quiet song and strange power to spring in us, up and out through the rock. And with that, I will turn this over to you, Ashley and Danny, to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Lisa. It's good to be with you tonight, and it's been such a privilege for us to get to partner with Miss America, also known as MidAmerica, for this webinar series. They are glamorous over there at the UUA. I know that to be true. And yeah, this is our last of the series out of 6, and if you haven't watched the other ones, you should still be able to dive right in tonight. But our topic tonight is really about how do we minister to folks who are experiencing sort of the emotional upset or the fragility that often comes with doing justice work. How do we minister to the folks who are these long-term social justice warriors who've been doing this forever and are beginning to experience burnout, all those sorts of things. So we're going to kind of dive right into a conversation here tonight. Danny and I are going to kind of draw on stories from the congregations that we've had experiences with, and you can probably hear my 3-year-old crying outside the door. She's with her grandfather. So we all do ministry and work for social justice in the context of our real lives, which is one of the reasons why we offer a webinar like this, is because we often find difficulty in striking that balance. So we're going to begin. I'm going to show a few slides here, and Danny and I are just kind of going to riff for a little bit. So you're going to not see our faces, but you'll see slides for a little while. And I am going to share my screen here if I can make the tech work. All right, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. There we go. Here we are. So that last line, "A strange power to spring in us," is actually from the poem by Denise Levertov that we just offered. It's a beautiful poem, and I encourage you to take it and meditate on it. We're going to start by talking about some patterns that we notice in congregations. And the first here is, several congregations that we've worked with in the last year have sort of experienced this kind of thing. But you see our picture of Wonder Woman here. This is the social justice superhero congregation. People will say things like, Kathy is our social justice person. She does it all, so we don't have to. Danny, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
And Can you hear me? And what I've seen is we're going around the congregations and doing this work. Usually Kathy is the person that is showing up for almost everything. And the congregation really relies heavily upon Kathy's expertise, her feedback, her knowledge of it, part relationships that are there. And looking for the congregation puts all that on Kathy's shoulders as opposed to it being something that we all are able to do together.
Exactly. So I'm sorry, tech question. Are you guys seeing my full screen or are you seeing all of my windows and my audio here?
We're seeing your whole screen.
Okay.
So we
Bring it
see
back.
exactly what tabs you have open, and
Okay.
like
So
the a cappella song list.
Yeah. So this kind of congregation, we'll jump back in. Sorry about the tech issues here. This kind of congregation often is one in which there's some really siloed social justice work, right? So this is the congregation where social justice is really sort of like part of a program. It's in competition with other programs of the church, and folks are really happy to just have that one social justice superhero. And as Danny mentioned, this is the person who kind of gets outsourced, and that person, of course, is at risk for a lot of burnout. So we'll look at another pattern here. We call this the everybody does social justice on their own congregation. I love this little comic here. I tried to organize a stampede, but everybody has their own agenda. So this is the congregation where we talk about everybody is already doing social justice work outside of the congregation. And so, we don't need to do it here together. Danny, you had a recent story kind of about that. You want to comment on that?
I was just in a congregation up here doing some work. What we had found was that there was the work was happening, but it was happening kind of in these siloed sectors with people. So there was someone that was doing deportation work and immigration. There was another person who was showing up for disability, disabled workers' rights. There was another person maybe doing some stuff around, racial injustice that's happening in the community. And all of it is congregational justice work, and it's just like, but everybody's doing it, on their own, in their own little corner. And there's not this strong desire to come together, but yet we're a part in this, and we're saying that we're a congregation hoping to show up. And what I've seen happen with this is that then we're going back to the Kathy congregation, Kathy, who's superhero lady, that usually the one particular social justice or racial justice item that's kind of hot and buzzing at the time is the one that then begins to burn it at both ends. And so it promotes a kind of a congregational perspective where it can become competition in some respects.
Congregations where, when we ask, how's your social justice ministry? They say, well, we've got a congregation full of social workers and politicians and educators, and everybody is out there doing this work all the time. And so they just want to rest when they come to church. And there's sort of a narrative that gets created about we can't do stuff together because people are already doing it all out there, right? Okay, next one. Call this the Harmony at All Costs congregation. We've got our Peanuts cartoon here. Linus, that's Linus, right? Yeah. Linus says, I don't like to face problems head on. I think the best way to solve problems is to avoid them. This is a distinct philosophy of mine. No problem is so big or so complicated that it can't be run away from. So the thing that we often hear in congregations is this thing about some people, right? This is the sword that is wielded. Some people are upset about how much we talk about social justice. We should just lay off for a while, or people are going to leave, right? Yeah. Danny, you want to say something about that one?
Yeah, I was thinking about the time when BLM was really active up here in Minnesota, and there was every other protest, every other action, folks were just, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And unfortunately, there were some folks so we're just like, enough already. We showed up to a protest. We brought water to a rally. We allowed, them to use our space. We time out now and thinking that there's breaks and it's kind of working. Or there's this thing where there's congregants that are tired of hearing it from the pulpit, that are sending emails to the minister about why are you getting arrested and stopping, the light rail or traffic for this particular issue or whatever. Haven't we done enough? We're a sanctuary church. So those kind of things I've seen run into out here in this work.
Yep. And I just want to note here, I've done some work with congregations around the country through the program Beloved Conversations, which is a small group ministry program helping congregations address racism. And one of our congregations that I've worked with had done the program for 4 or 5 years. They'd probably done 6 or 7 different cohorts of people who'd gone through, and it had been wildly successful. Lots of participation, lots of people really excited about the work. And for a long time, it sort of seemed to be going forward really great. And then when we got to I think it was year 5 of this program, we started to experience the resistance. And I was hearing from the folks who were in the congregation, in particular people of color, including a religious professional, that all of a sudden there was all this backlash about, well, it's not that we don't want to do racial justice, but that's the only thing you ever talk about. They started complaining about the way that this person was doing their job. They started saying, our major donors are going to leave. People are going to leave. The congregation is going to shut down if we don't draw our focus somewhere else. And so the thing I want to highlight from this story is that often it takes resistance in some situations a while to build. This is there's a lot of energy at the beginning when a congregation really dives into social justice work, in particular into racial justice work. People are all on board ideologically. We know that Unitarian Universalism calls us to struggle for justice. But what happens is that over time, as systems actually begin to shift and people who are used to being in power notice that they don't have the same kind of influence, or they feel like the demographics of their congregation are changing. More young people, more people of color, more people of other marginalized identities are around. It starts messing with their sense of home and importance. And it's very typical that in congregations like that, you'll get a bunch of resistance that doesn't happen right away, but kind of down the road. There's this old adage that to people who are used to privilege, equity feels like discrimination, right? The idea that when we're used to being able to take up all the space or having all the power, having the last word, when we start balancing things a little more, it feels like we're losing a lot. And so that's the kind of resistance that can come up later. And what happens then in a congregation that has a culture of conflict avoidance, that doesn't have really good structures for helping people get at the root of what's causing discomfort, that doesn't minister to that discomfort while also supporting the people who are leading things forward, is that the conflict avoidance can manifest and everybody freaks out. And what happens is you get a congregational meeting where people are panicking about a budget. And that's how social justice gets put on the back burner, as people are like, if we continue to do this or fund this program or focus on justice issues in this way, everybody will leave. And so it's deeply tied to sort of a scarcity mentality. Yeah. And people don't want to rock the boat. So those are just a few of the patterns that we've noticed. And we want to talk a little bit about some underlying causes for those patterns. Danny, you want to take the first one and we'll go back and forth here?
So it says the congregation views social justice as a program rather than a deeply embedded way of being a community. Social justice competes with worship, religious education, and other activities for resources, visibility, and members. You see, there was a church that I was doing some work with, and they had a couple different kind of social justice or racial justice teams that were doing same or similar work, but really were striving for identity alone, whatever that was about. And then what happened is that it it just kind of became their little project, and it wasn't something that the congregation had saw as was their own. I mean, this was a team that the board had voted and said, yes, we can have this particular, expression of justice work in our congregation, but it's not largely being seen. And so then what happens is now there becomes this kind of competition with the other established programs that are happening at the church.
Right. And so when we view it as an activity rather than a thread that goes through all of the activities of the church, it's easy to slash the budget or to say, nope, we need this person for this committee, so they can't do that this year. And it really gets siloed, which is a problem. So the next one, leadership, both lay and ordained folks, are not vocally and visibly committed to embodying practices of justice in all areas of congregational life. So what we mean is, like, if you've got a director of religious education who is really disconnected from the work of the social justice committee, and actually that's probably a bad example because our religious educators are so often the folks who are leading this stuff. But if you've got a minister who's not really vocally supporting the church to hang up the BLM banner or to become a sanctuary congregation, if you've got a board chair who doesn't believe that conversations around justice work and justice commitments belong in a board meeting, the congregation as a whole gets a sense that that's not a priority. And so it really takes leadership in all areas of church life to be able to do that kind of support work that helps hold the united front, really.
In the ways in which we see the justice-related issues and how they change over time. The issues we were fighting a couple years ago have morphed into some different ways in which they present themselves in the world. And so it's important that when we've seen patterns in congregations where leaderships don't regularly receive justice-related training and spiritual reflection opportunities as a part of leadership development and faith formation. That becomes important because I think about the curriculum that Ashley has taught, Beloved Conversations, and I've done it with a congregation that was some years ago. It was a different iteration then, and so the congregation had done some great work in that particular iteration of the curriculum, and we're resting kind of on the laurels of that. Like, hey, okay, cool. So we're resting on the laurels of that work and having, there were other trainings that were coming about. What does nonviolent direct action look like? Which Beloved Conversations doesn't necessarily speak to. It speaks to a different lens of this. And so how do we stay, at the helm of this, doing this type of work? And if we have leadership that doesn't regularly receive that, or having a praxis model of spiritual reflection and around the work afterwards, then where's the development happening there? Yeah. This is my 3-year-old son. I have one of those too. Like, Ashley has okay, get out of here.
And yeah, so I want to pause here and talk about two things. First of all, Danny mentioned praxis, and we make reference to this in the Moose Jaw rubric that I believe is going to be up with the recording of this. We've put the link in the chat. But the basic concept of praxis is that it's a cycle, so that there's some sort of action. Maybe you go out to a rally together, you travel to the Women's March, you do a service project, but some sort of action that folks are doing together. Then there's some sort of reflection afterward about what the experience meant, what we learned from it. And then there's some learning, right? And the learning could be, okay, so we just did a house build for Habitat for Humanity. Maybe let's spend some time thinking about what the root causes of homelessness are in our city. What policies are in place? What kind of racial disparities or disparities in ability or income are feeding into the cycle? And then you go back and do another action, right, with that new learning and forming. And it becomes this cycle of learning, action, and reflection. So that praxis model needs to live at the heart of congregational life so that it doesn't become this checklist like Danny's talking about. And then we also, in this last bullet point on this slide, mention justice-related training and spiritual reflection as part of leadership development and faith formation. So when we use that term faith formation, what we mean is that all of us are working on developing, deepening, re-articulating, reinterpreting our faith throughout the lifespan, right? From the time we're small children to the time we die. And we understand that justice work and justice, weaving justice with the ideas of our faith. You know, why are we called to do this work? What are the resources that our faith gives us to approach any particular issue? That's a part of faith formation. And so grappling with those questions, gaining new skills, being in relationship with new people is how we grow and expand our faith. And without the opportunity to regularly engage in that kind of reflection and action, our faith can stay stagnant and we feel like we've arrived somewhere when in fact there's so much more to do. All right, so we'll move on to the next one here. So this is a classic. These patterns can occur because justice leaders are not tapped for leadership positions outside of social justice committees or projects, right? We've got Wonder Woman who does all the immigration stuff, but nobody ever thinks of her for the board or the worship committee or the finance committee, right? Who's creating the budget. What would happen if you had people who are deeply committed to social justice principles and values and work, and then you helped those people to rise up into positions of leadership, not just in the social justice program area, but in all areas of congregational life? How would having leaders who are deeply committed to justice shape the way that the budget is created, or shape the worship practices of the congregation, shape the lifelong religious education program? Danny, I'll turn it over to you.
Following one says, the congregation has only one or two ways for members to engage in social justice work. Anyone who doesn't feel called to or cannot participate in that way feels excluded and outside of the community. And so these patterns occur when people aren't. So I was just at a rally the other day. It was a campaign that's happening nationwide here. And it was a rally that hadn't really lifted up a particular demographic of people that were impacted, and you were only able to show up in these particular ways. Okay, well, I want to be able to, I can't be there, so I would love to show up in, a social media aspect, and this is more of a social action, direct action kind of a team that's where we have to be out there and on the front line. And so it's like, if you can't be out there, if you can't be on the front line, if it's during work hours, then this doesn't apply to you. This isn't, you're excluded from this. And though you feel very passionate about doing the work, and you have that kind of thing that begins to divide a congregation to a degree when people start feeling outside of something that they feel passionate about.
Yeah. So this is also a question of accessibility, right? There's both the aspect of I am just not somebody who's gonna, cook a meal, or I am not somebody who has any tech skills. I'm not somebody who is gonna get arrested doing civil disobedience. There's also the pieces that Danny was mentioning about if I'm a single parent and I work a second shift job, I'm not necessarily going to be able to go to an action that's happening during the day. So these are real questions about having multiple on-ramps for people to engage. So is your congregation, if, let's say that your congregation is focusing on immigration and sanctuary right now, are there ways for the folks who are ready to get arrested to get involved in frontline sort of protest and civil disobedience? Is there also maybe a book group that's happening for folks who really just want to enter gently and learn around themselves? Is there a letter writing ministry for folks who are interested in developing relationships with people who've been incarcerated by ICE? Is there a group of folks who are showing up for accompanying people to deportation hearings? All of those are ways that people, according to their time, to their ability, to their passion, to their skill, can participate more deeply. So we'll move on to the next one again. So this is, again, about conflict avoidance, right? The congregation prioritizes harmony over commitment to its mission and isn't willing to upset people and or lose members. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is. The reality is, as Danny mentioned, there are people who, when the congregation commits to, takes a bold public stand on something, there are always people who will either threaten to take their toys and go home or actually do, right? And again, this brings up fears of like, oh my gosh, is there going to be a split in the congregation? Are people all going to leave and we're not going to have a church anymore? And those are real fears. And so often those fears impede the congregation from sticking with the commitment that they're trying to make. And what we don't often talk about is that when congregations have real clarity of mission and they're not willing to put up with temper tantrums and poor behavior when folks are upset about that kind of thing, new people show up. New folks see the clarity of that mission and the passion of that commitment, and it builds new community. It builds new ways for people to engage, and sometimes a different crew of folks will show up. I know Danny, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about, and it ties in a little bit to the last one we talked about, with accessibility fits into this one as well. There was a congregation I've done some work with that had, drafted some ends and means that they wanted to make their congregation more accessible to the community that they were based out of. And so there was a campaign and a drive that went forth around it to begin to change some of the structural designs of the building to begin to now meet that need. And there was harmony for the most part around that. A building got finished and it was ready for all of that. And then when it was time to for lack of better words, like cash in on that promise, here's community coming in and saying, now the congregation is like, whoa, I don't know if we want to move this fast. And there's these different things. And so it's just, but this was harmony at one point in time. And now it's people like, okay, well, if we do go this direction, we're going to, we're going to take our toys and go home. And so I've seen it happen in that way as well.
And I think a thing that's really important to highlight here, and I've seen this so many times in racial justice work in particular, is that, you'll have a congregation that makes a big commitment to racial justice work, and then people start getting uncomfortable at some point and start threatening to leave or saying this, I don't recognize this congregation anymore. And then leadership kind of caves and said, okay, well, we're going to appease those people and we're just going to put racial justice on the back burner. Now, it's not actually as if that creates true harmony and then everybody is happy again, right? People of color get left behind. People who are passionate about these issues get left behind. And often those folks don't have the same kind of positional power in the congregation. And so they actually leave, right? So it's not as if when we decide to do justice work that everybody's just going to go along, right? Sometimes we actually have to make choices about who the congregation is for and what our deepest principles are. And I think theologically, we sometimes get muddled, right? About, well, everybody can be a Unitarian Universalist. We have to accept every kind of person and every kind of behavior and every kind of belief in our congregation. And that's not actually true. When you have, different factions of folks who, let's say you've got one group of people who are strongly working for racial justice, are really looking to shift the way that things are happening both inside and outside of the congregation. And you've got a group of folks who say, this is not what I come to church for. I want something else. It really shouldn't be a battle of individual opinions. It needs to be going back again to the congregation's mission. What are we committed to? What have we agreed to be, not by, majority rules, but because we sense our call as a congregation? And that work is done over time. That is not something that can happen in the midst of a crisis that's happening over one particular issue, but we're going to get to that in a minute. But this is one of the ways in which we can avoid this kind of major conflict is by doing that work of reiterating and re-articulating and really inviting people to own the mission and vision together over time. Okay, a couple more quick things. Go ahead, Danny.
So the congregation doesn't provide support and nurturance for justice leaders who are leading the charge and experiencing pushback. Seeing that you have those who are putting themselves out there on the front line for this work and putting that not only their position and or title out there, but their personhood is out there as well. And the congregation is not providing that kind of support because they feel like this person may be an extremist in their opinion. It may feel like their efforts that they're contributing to it may be a bit excessive. And then even beyond providing support, then there's those who support the work of justice leaders out there doing this work, but don't know how to nurture. It becomes kind of a transactional relationship in that sense where it's like, okay, you get your marching orders, go out there and do the work, come back and report, but there's a nurturing that needs to happen. And how do we provide community around the leaders taking the charge when they begin to experience pushback? That may be inside of the congregation, that may be a particular large donor, that may be, folks outside of the congregation that are pushing back, and it's reflecting or potentially reflecting on the congregation. So how do we, again, provide that support and nurturing to those who are out there doing that kind of work?
Yep. And then just in the way that you would expect in a congregation for the minister to have a close and nurturing relationship with a board president and their religious education folks, people who are in charge of various, the stewardship drive, right? Those folks get what some people would call, quote unquote, special attention. But really what it is, the leadership has to prioritize supporting the people who are in turn supporting larger numbers of people, right? And sometimes when you've got a Kathy, your Wonder Woman in your congregation, you're thinking, okay, she's great. I don't have to worry about her. And people are content to sort of let that happen while burnout can be sort of creeping in without that kind of support over time. So we come back to this question of mission again. The congregation hasn't done ongoing work to build buy-in for the mission among members, and or has not clearly articulated how social justice principles are connected to the mission. Lots of us have mission statements that are long and wordy. And some of our congregations really have done the work of incorporating a commitment to justice into their bylaws or into their end statements. But it's fairly common in my experience that folks do not, in the general, your regular members, not necessarily your board members, but you're like the folks who show up on Sunday and who maybe are involved in, an adult ed program or something. Most people don't really know what the mission of the congregation is, right? They can't say it back, but they also don't necessarily even have a sense of what that might be. And in these kinds of congregations where people, number one, don't understand the mission of the community, the driving force, why do we exist? And then also can't talk about we exist because of this, and therefore we work for justice in these ways. The congregations where your everyday member can't articulate that are ones in which you find a lot of conflict over social justice stuff, or simply, scattered or unfocused commitments to the work.
This following, this one we just talked about brings to mind an experience I had where the congregation was on board with the work to a degree, but not everybody. There was kind of a select group who knew. So there was like a particular team of folks that had and this particular team may have had some influencers on it that they were able to move in a way that, and then there were other folks in the congregation like, we are really interested in this. We love this work. We didn't know how, how to access it, where it began, and what is this, how does this align with our mission? And so to being more clear about it throughout. So they required more repetition in the congregation I was working at. I think there was 3 like kind of larger meetings to unpack and flush it out with folks to make sure as many people as who desired to get it got it. And though it may have seemed tedious or cumbersome, in the end it paid off because it created this ripple effect for the rest of the congregation where everybody was like, okay, now I get it. It lines up the ties. I guess that will lead into this next one where it says there are not clear paths and extra supports in place to nurture leadership of youth and young adults, people of color, and other marginalized groups. A story comes to mind during an occupation that we had here in Minneapolis, where there were youth from a particular congregation that were a part of their youth kind of tower club, and they went out and done particular social justice actions. And so they went out and came out to an occupation and participated strongly, to the point where some of the members in the congregations, and more so some of the older folks in the congregation, were feeling like, wait a minute, we need to pull you back, safeguard you, reel things in. But yet they had felt a real strong call, aligned with the missional values of the congregation, aligned with what they had been kind of hearing through, Sunday after Sunday, feeling a call to it. And then the congregation didn't really have a framework of how to support those youth. The parents were on board, like, hey, we don't mind, our daughter, little Kathy, before she was a superhero, going out and doing this work. Cool, but then it came to this place where, we put our thing in it. People of color in congregations oftentimes aren't represented at the level of influence and decision making. Yeah. And so though they may represent and or be connected to the impacted community or be members of the marginalized identity that we're saying we're standing up for, don't have a real voice of congregational support throughout their efforts of the work. So I think about some of that with these patterns here.
And I think that ties back to the idea that you need people with a variety of experiences and social locations, as well as, and a variety of abilities in all different areas of the church, right? Like you need, often what'll happen, like, let's say for folks of color, is they walk in a congregation and immediately somebody offers, you should be on our racial justice team, or a new young adult will come in and they'll be like, oh, would you like to lead a youth program? Or, parents of young kids will be like, do you want to teach RE? And we actually are doing ourselves a disservice when we pigeonhole folks because of how we perceive their identities to be, right? So when you put people who represent those different identities and who come from different experiences in their lives, when you put them on the board, when you put, people on the RE committee or on the worship committee, you are setting yourselves up for change to happen over time, right? And we're not talking just about like the token youth on the board or the token person of color on the RE committee. We're talking about actually working to shift the demographics of leadership groups. That includes staff, it includes the board, it includes any program committees or groups that are in decision-making positions. So how do we do it then? How do we minister to this resistance? We had our lone Wonder Woman before. One answer, one way to minister to resistance here is to have a whole universe of people who are leading with different gifts and skills. You've got the whole Marvel universe here. Leadership development, right? So what we mean by leadership development is a lot of things. We mean things like, how are you investing in future board members? Like, are you sending folks to leadership school when you see the potential in them, but not, 5 minutes after they walk in the door, and also not 10 years after they've been there, right? Like, is there a trajectory where people come in, they get rooted in Unitarian Universalist faith, and then they begin to be invested in so that there's a trajectory for moving into different areas of leadership? How are you centering the voices of young adults and youth, people of color, other marginalized identities? This often folks balk at this because it means money, right? It costs money to send people to GA or regional assembly or leadership school. It costs money to send people to a congregationally based community organizing training. But if you are serious in your congregation about shifting systems and really becoming rooted in justice practices and principles, you have to develop leaders. Danny, my friend, over to you.
This piece of Ministering to Resistance with having to get to this place of being able to say goodbye and letting people go in love. There are moments when, this season has transitioned. It's shifted. I mean, there's a different way that we care for the landscape of our congregation in the fall months of our congregation than we do in the spring months of our congregation. And if we don't have the kind of maintenance team to help manage and be able to move in that way, then we're going to have to consider letting folks go that aren't willing to move how we're moving. And that letting folks go isn't always easy, because it sometimes when we let people go, they don't leave. But let's be quite frankly with you. I pastor a church of my own and have had to, let some folks go. And, our heartstrings can be connected to people in that way, with that understanding of what's for the greater, good of the congregation here, and not in the sense of personifying the person or the position that may have to be let go of or, done away with in order to make room for what we aspire to show up around our mission and values for racial justice. Like being able to move and hold on to things with an intention, but with a looseness that allows it to be fluid.
And I think, Danny, that's a really important point. And again, it does come back to mission, right? If the leadership and the broad majority of people in the congregation understand that the mission, what the congregation is called to do and be, is more important than any one member, this becomes possible, right? We don't get held hostage by the large donor wants to take their pledge and leave, or we don't get held hostage by the chair of one committee who says, well, I'm going to quit and everything will fall apart. Because we're committed to the mission, right? Our congregation exists to do XYZ thing in this time and place. And so even if this person is really against that, we have to be able to prioritize the mission over a particular personality. And oh my God, is this hard, right? And, people, it's not always a temper tantrum, right? Like some people genuinely feel as their congregations shift, like they're losing their community, they're losing their institution. And so this is not to say that, if you're not with us, you're against us. This is not about like creating factions, but when there are groups of people or individuals who really just can't come along with the way that the congregation is clearly articulating a shared concept of mission, we have to be able to let those people go, or we sabotage the good work we're going to do.
Ashley, can I just share a story about that?
Yes.
There was one congregation I was working with at one point where the board decided to do something that was totally consistent with the mission of the congregation. It was a smaller congregation, but still, they also had professional leadership, so it wasn't that small. They had, full-time ministry and a DRE. In the board, there was one member of the congregation who gave 50% of the pledges total to the congregation.
Bad idea, by the way, to have your
really bad idea. But the board decided to have the strength of their conviction. And this member had said, if you do X, I'm going to take my money, my bat and ball, and go home.
Yep.
The board decided that they had to do X. They said goodbye to the member. And that year they held really their first complete annual budget drive. And they ended up raising more money without person X than they had with him. So they lost 50%, of their pledging, and they were able to replace that 50% and more because the congregation realized that it was being true to its mission and that they were not willing to be held hostage by any one person who resisted that. Now, I'm not promising you all that this is going to happen the same way, but I was just so amazed by the bravery of that congregation being willing to say goodbye to 50% of their funding.
And that speaks to the faith formation, the growing faith formation of that congregation. You know, in that sense, we're talking about leadership development, and there's an opportunity where the whole congregation and the board had an opportunity to not only develop in their leadership and how they showed up, but then how their faith has formed and shaped them in this way. That's an awesome story, Lisa.
Absolutely, and they're still doing really well, and they're doing other bold experiments that I'm not going to talk about because that would divulge who they were, and I don't have their permission to identify them. But they're really, it's really wonderful to see how that decision freed them up to be more alive in everything they do.
Oh, amen, hallelujah, praise Jesus. I love those stories. So, ministering to resistance, again, we've already said this, we'll say it again. You have to commit to the mission of the congregation. And it doesn't just mean getting people to memorize it, of course. It means having a process where folks are broadly across the lifespan, across, positions in the congregation, where lots of people are invited to have the conversation. Because this is where we figure out, right? Like, there are plenty of congregations that kind of zip through a mission statement process, and they spend a lot of time working on the words, and it sounds really great. But they'll get to the other side of it and realize that nobody really knows what it means. So if you haven't done the work to figure out, what do we mean when we say we show up for justice? What does that actually look like, both inside of our congregation and outside? Have those conversations in an ongoing way, and long before, the emergency happens, right? Long before your community partner shows up and says, hey, can we, send an undocumented person to seek sanctuary in your congregation? Have those conversations before, the Black Lives Matter chapter asks if you can use your congregation as their base for their work, right? You want to have those conversations long before those things happen so that you're clear, so that your leadership is clear, that there is broad buy-in, and that you can say yes, knowing that it is flowing from that shared sense of mission.
And in that way, I feel like your leaders are able to feel like they're covenanted in a way to be able to fulfill the overall mission. Again, going back to that congregation that I shared that made some structural changes to their building to open up. When that community came in, there was some of the leadership that would normally be at the table to make decisions about partnering or opening doors or whatever were not present at that time, but the leadership that was there was committed enough to the mission of what everyone said that they shared and had to say, we're gonna step out on faith and do this thing. And even though everything didn't look like how they thought it would, but it lined up with the mission. And it became a great empowering story for that particular congregation because it grounded those other leaders in a way of knowing that they sometimes as a senior leader in my congregation, there's times when other leaders there know what to do, are empowered to do what it is they can do, but aren't clear about the mission and or direction in that sense, if that makes sense. And so it's like, well, we were going to do it, but we wanted to wait for you. And so to be in a place where everybody's clear here about what it is, in my absence, by all means, let's commit to the mission.
Yep. And Danny, that's a perfect segue actually into
building relationships of trust.
Yep. You have to have these relationships of trust and accountability, right? Your leaders have to be able to trust each other, right? So exactly like you were saying, Danny, if I can't be there in the room at the board meeting or, the executive team meeting or whatever, the leadership has to know that they are empowered to act because they are trusted by the congregation, right? There needs to be a two-way street of trust where leadership trusts congregants, right? And that congregants trust leadership. And this kind of relationship is forged Sometimes in crisis, sure, absolutely. People begin to trust each other when there's emergencies and folks are called to act together in bold ways. When, I think a lot of folks, I'm thinking about our congregations in Colorado who've become sanctuary congregations long before the national conversation about sanctuary was happening. But it literally happened when somebody showed up on their door and they needed to make a very quick decision. And so it wasn't as if they could go through a long, laborious congregational vote. Leadership had to be trusted and empowered to make those decisions. And the strength of those relationships makes it much easier to make the decisions when those crisis moments happen. But most of the time, those relationships are forged by checking in on each other, right? By taking the time to have a check-in at the beginning of your committee meeting or your board meeting, by, the minister having coffee with leaders and making sure that, each person knows what's going on in other people's lives. It happens in fun and joy and celebration. And now those are the bonds that sustain us in moments of crisis.
And I think it's how we all are together matters in building relationships of trust and accountability. And I think about congregations, or the congregations you described, Lisa, that had this kind of space and place of how they work together matters, that created the accountability mechanism, for lack of there, that we can lean into this even more so in ways of trusting one another. It's almost like formation pattern flying of, knowing that there's grace is present for a time of release and self-care and falling back, but knowing that we're still all here together and trusting in the particular leadership. There was one quick story of a leader I was working with a congregation that had took a really bold stance around a particular racial justice issue in the community, and was kind of a lone wolf out there. But there was a level of accountability that was in place within the congregational team, that there was trust whenever there was movement that may have been outside of the purview of the team, that may have been outside of the purview of being able, as Ashley said, going to running by the board of directors, and seeing that had it worked with this particular person in a way that empowered them to flourish even more so, or blossom even more so into the gifts that they were flowing in. And, sometimes folks can be in that and be maybe hesitant because they want everybody's approval or whatever. That trust and accountability was there for them in the work.
Yeah. And I would add here too that these relationships of trust and accountability, the nurturing relationships, the one that keep us sane when things get hard. Often we'll find, especially, we do a lot of work with small fellowships, often without professional leadership, in rural areas of the state where they're the only progressive religious game, for like 100 miles. And when you've got, your one or two social justice leaders in that congregation, oh man, do they start to feel alone, right? Not only are they sort of like in the midst of a geographical area, a community that doesn't necessarily share their values, but even within the congregation, they're just really trying to, push the boulder uphill by themselves. And so I just want to emphasize here that it's really important for us to connect with each other, right? We are the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. And, in my organization, and I know a number of the other state advocacy networks, MidAmerica Region works on this too, but what we try to do is to put people in touch with each other, to help people feel less alone, to help people to know that they don't always have to reinvent the wheel, that there's wisdom and experience and support from congregations and individuals who have done the same things, who've been in the same places and fought the same struggles. And really the basis for long-term effectiveness in justice work is deep relationships. We can talk about systems and structures, but it matters that you care about the people and that you feel supported and seen and loved by the people that you're doing the work with. Danny, I'll throw this one to you.
So create multiple on-ramps for participation. We covered a little bit of this earlier, but again, this goes back to talking about accessibility. So for folks to be able to get in during the Mike Brown time of racial injustice in our community, we saw a lot of protests in the streets that were happening. Folks were coming out and occupying places, shutting down highways. There were just a lot of different ways in which folks felt called that were visible. And there was a congregation that that saw fit, that was leading a lot of that work. It was like, wait a minute, not all of our members, not all of our congregants feel called to the front line to go out there. So some of them feel called to show up in ways of sitting shiva, holding space, a brief space with someone. And so they hosted a vigil for folks that were impacted by, the non-indictment of Darren Wilson. And the church was packed. There was actually more church members at the vigil than there were. And there was a great representation at the dying and the protest, but the church was packed in that sense. And what became awesome, what I saw there, is that particular on-ramp created an intersection for the folks that sometimes are out there doing the work on the front line, don't oftentimes have an opportunity to be in community or relationship around the narrative with folks who may not feel called to show up in that way. And so you had this pause, if you will, or this moment of reprieve to be in community together around it. And it was amazing on-ramp. Other folks from that particular vigil felt empowered or felt like the space was brave enough to go out to frontline. And so then there was actions or training actions that were happening. So folks were like, before I get out to the front line, I want to know what I'm doing. So the church was offering training workshops, like, organizing 101. What does it mean to show up and be an ally with an impacted community? Times for spiritual reflection afterwards. We're, learning those kind of, so folks were getting on to the justice thing from different vantage points, but there were multiple on-ramps for participation. That's just to name a couple that I've worked with and seen.
Beautiful. I think it's a lot parallel to like theme-based ministry. When a congregation chooses to do theme-based ministry and they find ways to incorporate that theme into the newsletter, into Sunday worship, into religious education for children and adults. Maybe it's happening in the covenant groups, right? So like, how is this, whether it's a particular justice issue or, a community commitment to, let's say, a partner organization, how are you inviting people to engage with that from your, 85-year-old member who is housebound to your 7-year-old participant in Sunday school to your, childless young adult who's single and has a lot of social media savvy to your, married couple in their 50s with kids? How are you inviting all of those people by different ways into the work? And then, as Danny was mentioning, this is hugely important, inviting theological reflection. What we mean by that is simply, how does our understanding of our faith, our deepest values, our commitments, our belief in interconnection and the inherent worth and dignity of all people, why does that call us to the work of, let's say, racial justice or economic justice or environmental justice? Why does this congregation feel called to send our folks to Standing Rock or to support the local Black Lives Matter chapter or to become a sanctuary congregation? What is the history? What can we learn? What can we inherit from our religious ancestors, who have been through things like this before? What can we learn from contemporary people who are thinking and providing thought-provoking ideas for us to consider, often from different faith traditions than Unitarian Universalism? Danny, I know you wanted to say something about this too.
The importance for me in seeing the theological reflection, it speaks volumes to the opportunity for the individual as well as the congregation to do that faith formation work. This is where I personally feel like sustainability comes in, and not only in being kind of current and relevant in the work, but sustainability in relationships that we've created, relationships that may have been lost or severed or become conflictual as a result. Like always in this mode of reflecting as opposed to getting to a place of resolve, I think keeps us at this place of where we're able to see how sacred this work is and not just seeing it as like a plateau.
Right. And one of the ways that, for example, we do this at Moose Jaw is we offer a couple of times a year an online video covenant group for justice leaders. Danny has been running it this past season. But, we invite people to come together, from various congregations. They gather once a month, and there's a theme. So we're going to reflect on, let's say, forgiveness, but with a justice lens, right? So we invite people to bring their own stories from their congregations to reflect, to take that pause from being the leader of things, but to really dig deep into our values, our history, the deep thoughts that animate and call us to this work. And I know those experiences have been really profound. So that's something anybody could do in their congregation, right? Is like, what if you gathered somebody, a small group ministry from, various parts of the church, and you do a justice-centered theological reflection group, a small group ministry group. That would go a long way toward nurturing the spirits of those justice leaders. So to finish up here quickly, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. We're just going to race through. We said all the things the congregation shouldn't do and how we minister to some of those pieces where resistance can crop up. But this last chapter is really about the role of the justice-rooted congregation. If your congregation is deeply rooted, systemically rooted in a commitment to justice, and it shows up everywhere, here's what you're doing. Your congregation is equipping individuals to show up well for whatever they're passionate about, grounded in their identity as you use and as members of the congregation, right? So your folks who are maybe on their own doing, going to show up at a particular action or protest out in the community, they're showing up there not, coincidentally, but because their faith compels them to, and they're well skilled, they've had some training, they've done reflection, and they show up as productive and accountable members of the community.
And the role of the justice-rooted congregation is also helping members understand the practice of justice as a lifelong, ongoing part of faith formation and spiritual practices. So this is where we see that justice begins to get planted in our hearts as a pilgrimage, as opposed to being a moment and or an event, a rally that we show up, that we're in this as this lifelong, ongoing part of our faith formation, of growing into this. And sometimes that means that we'll have to be more intentional about nurturing our members of our congregations around this. Is I think what I've seen is there's sometimes a proclivity for those of us who get it to just kind of get in the rhythm of getting it. And we have to make sure that, we're keeping that harmony of the work in that sense with building the faith and justice work.
As we've mentioned before, the congregation is charged with providing multiple on-ramps for justice work that invite various levels of experience, skill, ability, and passion into the work.
Doing shared discernment work around what the congregation is being called to do in your local context is determined by your mission, moving resources, partnering with local leaders, brokering relationships of accountability and mutuality. This is that coming out of the comfort zones, coming outside of the four. I mean, if we believe that, the moral arc of the universe is bent towards justice, that means that we're going to have to come out of the place where it was comfortable for us to begin bending that work and getting to those spaces of real identifying the areas that we may not have the kind of strength and capacity. That's where we're brokering those relationships of accountability and mutuality. Who else is doing this work to where we can show up in a much stronger way in this, and then being able to allocate resources around these issues.
Yeah. And I just want to remind us that, no matter how small a congregation is, I'm thinking of fellowships of 30 or 40 people, right, out in rural parts of our state. it is always more powerful for that congregation to show up together and say, we are speaking as a congregation, we are acting as a congregation, than for those 30 or 40 people to show up as individuals, right? We live in a society that takes institutions seriously. And so even the smallest of our congregations can leverage their power, right? And so it matters that you do the work internally to figure out what you're being called to do. Likewise, we need to be investing in leaders who have that deep commitment to justice and who can infuse justice principles into every area of congregational life. Often we feel that leadership scarcity. Oh my God, who are we going to get to serve on the board? It feels like a drag, right? And often the answer to that feeling of scarcity is to be like, who haven't we asked yet? And what would it take to make that a positive experience for that person? Who else would need to be in the room? How would we need to shift the culture of leadership? And how are we going to invest in those leaders?
Prioritizing the congregation's mission and commitments to justice over the comfort of members and the absence of conflict. And that's that leaning into the tension. Again, I think that we can get into this place where we rest upon the laurels of some of the mission or work and commitments we've done in the past. And that can create like this rocking chair syndrome within the congregation where you have motion, but it denotes no progress. You're moving around, you're not going anywhere. And sometimes that movement is going to create some conflict in there, but we have to prioritize our mission over that conflict. Thank you.
This next one, provide training, spiritual care, and public support to members leading justice work within the congregation. And just a side note again, that means financial investments as well. Is there a budget line for leadership development and for training for your folks? So these slides are going to be made available to all of you after the fact on the MidAmerica website. And Lisa, I see your question here, and I will respond to you in a second. But yes, it would be lovely if you want to do some closing words for us after we do questions. But those, these are just some recommendations from us in terms of what we've seen and the patterns that we've observed. But we would be happy to take a couple of questions, either to clarify stuff we've talked about or to share observations or thoughts that you might have in response to some of those things. We were so clear. There are no questions. This is great.
A lot of this really resonated with me. We have a whole lot going on right now. We have created in our budget line items for having a lead delegate, which I signed up to do. And then, oh yeah, by the way, I'm also going to go to leadership school, and I'm getting a lot of that paid for by the congregation as well. So it's kind of crazy, but and then we have the Poor People's Campaign happening here in Kentucky, where they're being barred from entering the Capitol. So our minister has decided he will be there every Monday as long as this goes on. So we've had so many of these scenarios fit our congregation with everybody's doing social justice or doing some kind of good work somewhere in their lives and their work and their whatever. And it's really hard to come up. Oh, we had an interim minister and trying to get a mission or a main thing. We failed. We came up with 3 things. And to me, what that speaks to is intersectionality. I learned that word after the fact, but it really does, that gives me hope that we do know where we want to go. We just want to do it all at once. Yes. So having our minister who's ready to just take that leap and go and invite us to join him is going to be a really interesting challenge, and a lot of these things that you talked about tonight are going to be helpful, especially as I am on the board and stuff, to help me remind people and encourage everybody to do the reflections and the support for him as well as anybody else who gets on board.
Well, blessings to you in that work. Good for you for saying yes.
Well, yeah, it's all Eric's fault. No, not exactly. We really enjoy going to General Assembly and trying to bring it back to our congregation. There are some people that get it, and most people just don't have a clue what happens there. So,
thank you.
So I have a question, or a request for advice. For those congregations that are in after pastor situations, thoughts you might have about working to build that trust and accountability.
Yeah.
That's so important to moving forward with this in those scenarios. Just any thoughts or bits of advice you might have for that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And what I can say is that the congregations that are the least risk-loving, the least willing to take chances, and that can be around building a new building or making a public stance on a social justice issue or, whatever the thing may be. But my experience is that the congregations that are the most risk-averse are the ones who are, after pastor, they have a history of sexual misconduct or other abuse, or potentially a major history of conflict within the congregation, right? Like there was a split at some point, or they did have that major donor get up and walk away or something like that. Mm-hmm. So my words of advice are really about doing the work to understand the DNA of congregational culture, right? Lisa, I'm sure you could drop in some words here too about, the importance of doing a good startup when you have a good minister, of addressing conflict when it arises and accessing the resources of the region and your local good officers. But, if that history exists in a congregation, it will come out when you're trying to talk about justice. Absolutely. Right. Lisa, I want to invite you to jump in here because I know you can speak to this.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left of our time, and I mean the impact of in an after pastor congregation, for those who might not be familiar with the term, that is where a minister has violated professional boundaries in one way or another, many times sexual, often in other ways as well, through mishandling of funds or through other breaches from what is norm. And although we call it after pastor, it could also be prominent lay leaders as well in the congregation or any other staff. But that just has such a profound and lasting impact. And if that is part of your congregation's history, then that is something that we advise the board and professional staff look at and see, how do we raise this in a way that is helpful to figuring out how to resolve it, or at least acknowledge it enough so that we can begin to try to rebuild the trust. And in our region, I am the person who is the front line for safe congregations work and after pastor stuff. So my suggestion would be, if you're listening to this and it applies to you, give me a call or drop me an email and we can help you figure out how to do it, because we can't do it in a couple minutes.
Right. And I know we have to wrap up, but I just want to add one more thing, which is when your congregation is trying to make a big commitment to a social justice issue or a building, whatever the big thing is, pause before moving forward to say, what is the relevant information about our congregational history and our congregational culture that's going to come up? Because it's going to come out one way or another. And if you're not prepared to handle it, as Lisa said, in a proactive and healthy way, it will more than likely derail anything you want to do in a congregation.
Yeah, you need to have impeccable process that involves everyone, that pushes the pause button several times through, so that people can catch their breaths and know that they can trust what's going on, and it's not another time when they will be run over, as many people feel when faced with that kind of situation.
Yeah.
Ashley, Danny, any last words before I thank you and close us out?
I just want to say thank you for this time. This has been a great webinar that we've had today. Thank you to the crew that joined us, and blessings to you all.
Yep. And to anybody watching after the fact, we appreciate you tuning in. And again, thanks from us at Moose Jaw to the MidAmerica region for making this partnership possible. We think this has been a really exciting series, and we certainly have gotten a lot out of these conversations, and we hope you all have too.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley and Danny. Yes, we have gotten enormous amounts, as have our congregations, and will congregations receive in the future as they view these after the fact in the on-demand stuff. We appreciate your deep devotion and dedication to social justice work and helping our congregations do this in the best way and theologically appropriate ways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just gushing here. So, but I want to close this out with these closing words by dear friend and colleague Wayne Arneson, which suit many different kinds of situations, but in this case, it's particularly relevant as we today are facing some of the challenges that we have to protecting individuals who happen to reside here and also around the world. And so Wayne wrote, "Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear. Take courage. For deep down there is another truth. You are not alone." And so thank you all for what you're doing for justice in our world these days. Thank you for being part of this webinar. Thank you for having the courage, and know that we here at MidAmerica are willing and to support you as you do this work moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.